There's a stirring deep within me. Could it be my time has come? When I see my gracious Savior face to face, when all is done, is that His voice I am hearing? Come away, my precious one. Is He calling me?
Hello and welcome to the second session in our study of the end times. If we're going to search out what the Bible has to say about the end times, we ought to begin with Jesus. After all, since he is the lead actor in the drama of the end of the world, it would probably be a good idea to get a good look at those events through his eyes. So in this session, we'll be reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 24 and 25. This happens to be one of the major New Testament texts cited by dispensational premillennialism in support of that view of the end times. The argument is that these chapters provide a sort of end times manual, which allows us to determine the general conditions and therefore the general time frame in which the Lord will return to initiate his millennial reign. So let's read together Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" We see in this text that Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple raised three questions on the part of the apostles. When will these things happen? That is, the events leading up to the destruction of the temple. What will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? That is, the end of the world. And at face value, it would seem that the apostles thought that they were asking the same question three different ways. They assumed that the events they were asking about were all just different aspects of the same critical moment in history. After all, if God's holy temple were to be destroyed, then surely such a cataclysmic event could be nothing less than the end of the world. And even though at this point in their understanding of Jesus' mission, the apostles had barely gotten their heads around the fact that Jesus is going to be leaving them, they did understand that if he left, he would someday return, and that this return would somehow be associated with the end of the world. As we continue reading, we'll see that Jesus didn't answer these questions in the same order in which they were asked. And his answers reveal that the things that he described were not all a part of the same event. In this session, we will look at Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 to 36 in three sections, corresponding to Jesus' statements in answer to the apostles' questions. Statement number 1 is contained in verses 4 to 14. Statement number 2 is found in verses 15 to 28, and statement number 3 is found in verses 29 to 38. Statement number 1 is concerned with the apostles' question about the second coming and the end of the world. We know that because he twice speaks of the end. And in verse 4, Jesus warns them about the rise of false prophets, trying to build a reputation for themselves and attract a following by predicting the time of the end. He says, "See to it that no one misleads you." Then he goes on to enumerate a number of possible circumstances and experiences that will befall the church that could be falsely interpreted as signs of the end. Some of these false teachings would come from outside the church, as we read in verses 5 through 9. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. In these verses, we see four kinds of circumstances seemingly arising from outside the church, which could possibly be mistaken for signs of the impending end of time. First, there was the danger of messianic impostors, outsiders claiming to be Christ, trying to deceive people and lead them into all kinds of futile pursuits. And in fact, throughout the Christian age, pseudo-Christs and false prophets have often arisen, leading large groups of people, including many Christians, into disaster, with promises of a golden future or escape from impending doom. In modern times, an American named Jim Jones founded a cult called the People's Temple. It started off as an offshoot of a mainstream Protestant denomination. In the 1970s, Jones claimed to be the reincarnation of not one, but five historical leaders, including Jesus, Akhenaten, an ancient Egyptian pharaoh and religious innovator, Buddha, Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union, and Father Divine, who was an early 20th century spiritual leader in the African American community. On November 18th, 1978, gunmen from his private commune of Jonestown, Guyana, murdered U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan and four members of a delegation sent to investigate rumors of human rights abuses within the People's Temple. And then, facing certain reprisal from the U.S. government, Jones organized a mass murder-suicide among his followers, in which 909 people, including 304 children, drank a punch laced with cyanide. And after all the cultists were dead, Jones then took his own life by gunshot. And that atrocity gave rise to the expression drinking the Kool-Aid, to refer to being moved to a foolish course of action through popularity, peer pressure, or persuasion. In 1974, another American named Marshall Applewhite founded another cult. This one is called Heaven's Gate. And in 1995, he posted an internet message declaring himself to be Jesus, Son of God. On March 26, 1997, Applewhite and 39 of his Heaven's Gates followers committed mass suicide, believing that their spirits would rendezvous with a spaceship that they believed was hiding behind the Hale-Bopp comet. Well, besides the influence of seductive people like these we've looked at, Jesus also warned against the interpretation of unusual violence and warfare as signs of the end. And how many times has the carnage of war and human violence caused people to wonder if this was in fact the end of the line for this old world? Man-made terrors like the Holocaust, nuclear warfare, the Cold War, all have been cited at one time or another as evidence of the imminent end of the world. And yet we remain. In the same vein, Jesus warned against interpreting natural disasters as signs of the end. As examples, he mentioned famines and earthquakes, and his apostles were quite familiar with those. In our modern context, we could add to that list things like hurricanes, wildfires, pandemics, climate change, what have you. All used by some people to say it means the world is coming to an end and it's going to happen soon. But it hasn't happened. Finally, Jesus warned against mistaking opposition, persecution, and martyrdom of Christian people as definitive signs of the end of the world. Those things would definitely try the patience and resiliency of the faithful, but they were not to be mistaken for signs that Jesus would soon return to deliver them. Other circumstances that Jesus said might be falsely interpreted as signs of the end could originate from within the church itself, as we read in verses 10 through 12. At that time, many people will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. Here we see the possibility of apostasy. Many will fall away from the truth and fall into false and heretical doctrines. Also, there's the possibility of schism, divisions, the rise of factions, and breakdown of fellowship within the church. And then there's always the danger of false teachers from within. And usually these people are the instigators and perpetrators of the other two. But none of those possible disruptions of the peace and unity of the church are to be considered signs that the end is near. All these so-called signs, Jesus said, are but the beginning of birth pangs. They're like false labor. They are not to be interpreted as harbingers of the end. They are undesirable circumstances that the church will have to endure with patience. As Jesus said in verse 13, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. Most significantly, these difficult circumstances will in no way impede the progress of the gospel, as we read in verse 14. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, I want you to notice in verse 9 that Jesus used the word tribulation to describe the stressful circumstances that the church would have to endure in carrying out its mission to the world. This corresponds with one of John's visions recorded in the book of Revelation. There, to each of the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3, the triumphant Jesus promises salvation to those who overcome the challenges that they are facing, whether internal or external. Then, in chapter 7, John sees an uncountable multitude standing before the throne of God and before the Lamb. They're clothed in white robes and they're carrying palm branches in their hands. And this multitude is identified as the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Revelation 7:14. Now here's the important point. Nowhere in this vision do we have any indication of a group of saints being raptured. Now remember, according to the dispensational premillennialist view, faithful Christians will be raptured or taken away from the earth in advance of the tribulation, so they will not have to endure it. So, according to the dispensationalist view, these righteous ones who come out of the great tribulation in Revelation 7 would have to have been those who had been left behind at the rapture and then come to faith in Christ during the tribulation. Grammatically and logically, if they have come out of the tribulation, they would first have to have been in it. So if the rapture is an actual event, we would expect to see those raptured saints who were exempted from the tribulation to also be participating in this outpouring of praise to God for their salvation. But where are they? They're not there. The great tribulation of the church, as described by Jesus in Matthew 24 and by John's heavenly guide in Revelation 7, does not accord with the dispensational concept of a 7-year-long tribulation, which is supposed to immediately precede the millennium. The great tribulation described by John is an ongoing reality that extends throughout the church age. It's currently 2,000 years old, and counting, but certainly much longer than any period of a mere 7 years. Jesus' second statement in his discourse on the end times begins in verse 15. And here he answers the apostles' question concerning the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Here, Jesus gives the apostles a definite sign of the impending doom of Jerusalem. Verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. The apostles would have recognized this reference to the abomination that causes desolation as an allusion to the Old Testament book of Daniel. And if you'd like to look those references up later, they are Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27, chapter 11, verse 31, and chapter 12, verse 11. All of these are references to what Daniel called the abomination that causes desolation. In its original context, this abomination referred to the blasphemous desecration of the temple in 167 BC by the Greek Seleucid emperor Antiochus Epiphanes. But here, Jesus applies it to the Roman destruction of the temple in AD 70. And we know that Matthew expected the original Jewish readership of his gospel to grasp Jesus' meaning here, because he says in a parenthetical statement, let the reader understand. Now, Luke's account of this same event being written for a Gentile readership who didn't have such a firm grounding in Old Testament prophecy explains the abomination of desolation literally, without the word picture. Luke 21:20, he said, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. That abomination of desolation, that sign that the destruction of the temple was imminent, would be the massing of Roman armies around Jerusalem, an abominable force that would bring utter desolation, that is, abandonment or emptiness, to the holy city. As they listened to him, the apostles were probably reminded of Jesus' earlier lament over Jerusalem, as Matthew recorded it in chapter 23, verses 37 to 39, where he said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Well, after revealing the sign of the impending fall of Jerusalem, Jesus issues the first of two warnings contained in this section. We read the first one here in verses 16 to 22. Then all who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. His point here is that when the Roman armies surround Jerusalem, the disciples should not expect any miraculous last-moment rescue or delivery of the city. Rather, they should drop whatever they're doing and get out of there. This opportunity for escape, Jesus said, would be a gift of divine providence. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. According to the 4th century church historian Eusebius, the Christian population of Jerusalem did in fact flee the city before its destruction. and they found refuge across the Jordan River in the city of Pella. Now, the events making the Christians' escape possible may have been the suicide of Emperor Nero in AD 69, and that left a power vacuum in Rome that bordered on anarchy. And in what came to be called the Year of the Four Emperors, a series of 3 emperors briefly ascended the imperial throne. 2 were assassinated, 1 committed suicide. And at that point, Vespasian, the very general in command of the siege of Jerusalem, put the whole operation on hold. And he went to Alexandria in Egypt, where he was proclaimed emperor by his army, and thus became the 4th of the 4 emperors. Now, Vespasian's son, Titus, assumed command of the Roman forces surrounding Jerusalem, and during the next year, AD 70, he renewed the siege and completed the destruction of the city and the burning of the temple. But this interruption of Roman military activities around Jerusalem very likely constituted the shortening of the days, which gave the Christians the opportunity to flee to Pella before the fall of Jerusalem. Jesus says that the destruction of Jerusalem would be a great tribulation, as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Part of that tribulation the Jews brought on themselves. For when the Romans breached the walls and entered the city, the carnage that they found already there was unthinkable. Early in the invasion, before the Romans had actually even reached Jerusalem itself, civil war between competing factions within the city resulted in the slaughter of thousands of Jews at the hands of their own countrymen. And those opposing factions were bent on destroying each other's food supply. And so when the siege actually began, food quickly became so scarce that thousands starved to death. Now, of course, the Romans themselves added to the body count exponentially. When they arrived, many Jews ventured outside the city, hoping to find food in the valleys and alongside the walls. Well, they were caught and they were crucified. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that the crucifixions numbered some 500 every day. And the task of nailing so many people to crosses from dawn to dusk every day became so monotonous to the Roman soldiers that they began amusing themselves by nailing their victims to their crosses in different postures. But soon the Kidron and Hinnom valleys to the east and southwest of Jerusalem were filled with Jewish corpses. One defector reported that the number of dead was over 115,000. But because they heeded their Lord's warning, the Christian population was able to escape all of this. Now, in verses 23 to 27, we come to Jesus' second warning in this section. He said, "Then if anyone says to you, 'Behold, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, 'Behold, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. Or, 'Behold, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be." Jesus specifically warned against false Christs and false prophets who would try to deceive the residents of Jerusalem into believing that they would be miraculously delivered. One real-life example of such a false Messiah was a man named Simon Bar Giora. He was the leader of one of the factions inside the city. And Simon set himself up as the head of a messianic movement that promised to defeat the Roman armies and deliver Jerusalem. He even minted copper coins bearing the inscription, "Redemption of Jerusalem." But it came to nothing. And after the inevitable fall of Jerusalem, the burning of the temple, Simon retreated into hiding in an underground cistern for a short time. But unable to escape from there, he finally made a dramatic appearance among the ruins of the temple, dressed in a white tunic and a royal purple mantle, the garb of both a priest and a king. And he was hoping that his sudden and dramatic appearance would intimidate the Romans into breaking off hostilities and retreating from the ruined city. But it didn't work. Instead, Simon was arrested, sent to Rome. He was paraded through the streets in chains during a magnificent triumphal procession, and ultimately he was judged a rebel and a traitor by the Roman courts, and he was executed. Then in verse 28, Jesus finishes his answer to the question about the destruction of Jerusalem by repeating the sign of the abomination of desolation in different words. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. In something of a mini parable, Jesus portrays the Roman armies as vultures and Jerusalem as a corpse. And where the vultures are seen descending upon the corpse, the fall of Jerusalem and its temple will be imminent. Now, before we go on from here, let's pause for a minute for a little sidebar, if you will. Dispensational premillennialism interprets the events of Matthew 24, verses 15 to 28, as pointing to the great tribulation of Revelation 7 and 14, and the shortening of those days as a reference to the rapture of the saints before the tribulation begins. However, as we have just seen, the great tribulation attending the fall of Jerusalem, which Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24:21, was to be directed against Jews during the Roman siege of AD 66 to 70. This was a tribulation which the Christians escaped. And we should not confuse that tribulation with the great tribulation of Revelation 7 and 14, which was clearly to be directed against Christians. In this part of his discourse, Jesus is looking ahead in time no further than the Roman invasion of Judea, about 40 years into the future. He's certainly not looking ahead to the end of the world. And then in verses 29 to 36, having answered the apostles' questions about the signs that would indicate the destruction of the temple, Jesus returns to the questions about his second coming and the end of the age. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When each branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. First, Jesus says there will be no mistaking what is happening when the end of time comes. The heavens will be shaken, the celestial lights will go dark. In other words, the natural creation will begin to disintegrate. Christ will appear in the sky, glorious and powerful, in full sight of all mankind. And with the sound of a trumpet, angels will descend and gather the elect of all nations together in the sky. And the unsaved will mourn. As to when the end will come, Jesus spoke only in generalities. He said that it will come immediately after the days of the tribulation. specifically immediately after the tribulation described in his first statement in verses 9 to 14, where he was also addressing the questions about the second coming and the end of the world. And remember, it's that tribulation, not the one described in verses 15 to 28, that is to be identified with the great tribulation of Revelation 7:14. But the thing Jesus most wanted to impress upon his apostles at this point was the importance of being prepared at all times for the end. That's the significance of the little parable of the fig tree. The observable condition of a fig tree tells its owner when the growing season is just right around the corner. In the same way, Jesus said, when these things have come to pass, the end could come at any time. What things? Well, all the observable events he has mentioned in this discourse: the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, the tribulation of the church, and the proclamation of the gospel to the ends of the earth. Of crucial importance was the fact that all those conditions would be realized during the apostles' own generation. The date of this discourse was about the year AD 30. By the time of the deaths of Peter and Paul in about AD 65, the gospel had already been proclaimed throughout the Roman world. And the largely unrecorded ministries of the other apostles had spread the gospel throughout Africa and Asia during the same period. And then Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. Ever since the late 1st century AD, the conditions have been ripe for the return of Christ and the end of the world. He could return at any time. But as to the exact date or time of the second coming, Jesus had nothing to say because he simply didn't know. Only God the Father knows the month, day, and the year when Christ will return and the natural creation will come to an end. There will be no hints or warnings to allow any last-minute preparations for the end. It will come like a thief in the night. Therefore, the church must remain in constant readiness for the sudden return of her Lord. The rest of chapter 24 and most of chapter 25, in both teaching and in parable, emphasize the suddenness of Christ's return and the danger of being caught flat-footed and unprepared when that day comes. Now let's skip down to the end of Matthew 25, where Jesus gives a description of the final judgment that is so crucial to our study. It's a bit of a lengthy reading, but bear with me. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" The king will answer and say to them, "Truly, I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me." Then he will also say to those on his left, "Depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. Naked, and you did not clothe me. sick, and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they themselves also will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you? Then he will answer them, Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. These will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. This is the sheep and goats judgment, which is a major plank in the dispensationalist platform. But in the dispensational scheme, the sheep and goats judgment occurs, or is supposed to occur, just before the inauguration of the millennium. In their view, this sheep and goats judgment involves Gentiles only and separates those who have come to faith in Jesus during the 7-year tribulation from those who have not. The believers will be included in the millennial kingdom. The unbelievers will be sent directly to hell. And then 1,000 years later, at the end of the millennium, comes the end of the created order and another judgment called the Great White Throne Judgment, described in Revelations 20 and 11, and which allegedly involves only those who have lived and died during the millennial age. But Jesus clearly sees this sheep and goats judgment as taking place at the end of time and encompassing both the righteous and the wicked, with both being consigned to their eternal destiny. The sheep and goats judgment, as Jesus looks at it, is the same as the great white throne judgment of Revelation 7. The reward of the righteous, this judgment, is called the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world in verse 34. And then also in verse 46, this reward is called eternal life. So the kingdom prepared from the foundation of the world that Jesus describes here in Matthew 25 is of eternal duration, and it cannot be identified with the millennial kingdom of the dispensationalist view. 1,000 years is a long time, but it is certainly not eternity. So, contrary to the apostles' assumptions, the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, would not be the end of the world, nor would any global catastrophe, whether of natural or human origin, give warning of an impending end. And yet there always seem to be voices speaking from within the pale of Christianity, claiming to have special knowledge into the time of Christ's second coming and the end of the world. In the early 19th century, an American preacher named William Miller, based on his interpretations of certain prophecies in the book of Daniel, predicted that Jesus would return in the spring of 1844. And when the return failed to materialize at the predicted time, Miller adjusted his dates. In fact, he adjusted them twice. And on October 22nd, 1844, the date of Miller's third prophecy came and went. It failed. And that date became known as the Great Disappointment. And yet, despite his dismal record, Miller's following continued even after his death, the most notable example being the Seventh-day Adventist Church of today. In 1970, Hal Lindsey published his magnum opus, The Late Great Planet Earth, in which he predicted that the rapture would occur in about 1984. The starting point for his calculations was the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. And based, again, on prophecies from the book of Daniel, he asserted that the rapture should take place within one generation of that event in 1948. And doing precisely what Jesus said we should not do, Lindsey interpreted the signs that we've looked at in Matthew 24 as events of the tribulation which would precede the rapture. And he wrote, Jesus said that this would indicate that he was at the door, ready to return. Then he said, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. What generation? Obviously, in context, the generation that would see the signs, chief among them, the rebirth of Israel. A generation in the Bible is something like 40 years. If this is a correct deduction, then within 40 years or so of 1948, all these things could take place. Many scholars who have studied Bible prophecy all their lives believe this is so. Lindsey contends that the tribulation will be carried out by Antichrist through an all-powerful superstate composed of a unified Europe. He goes on later in his book. 3 phases of European unification are to be noted. First, the custom union, and by that he meant the abolition of trade barriers. Second, the economic union. Third, the political union. What we have created on the way to uniting Europe is a mighty economic political union of which nothing may be sacrificed for any reason. Its value exists not only in what it is, but more in what it promises to become. At about 1980, we may fully expect the great fusion of all economic, military, and political communities together into the United States of Europe. The statement is page 96 of the late, great planet Earth. It has now been over 70 years since the establishment of the modern state of Israel, almost 2 generations as Lindsey measures them, and yet the so-called rapture has not happened. The current European Union was formally established in 1992, 12 years after the time that Lindsey predicted the fusion of all the European states into the United States of Europe. And our current European Union, far from becoming a mighty economic political union of which nothing may be sacrificed for any reason, it's already started to fall apart with the withdrawal of the United Kingdom in the Brexit action of the year 2000. It's just not happening. And interpretations of world political developments, natural catastrophes, human calamities, as signs of the beginning of the tribulation, to be followed 7 years later by the inauguration of the millennial reign of Christ, followed 1,000 years after that by the end of the world. Those are all just meaningless words. Jesus' warning to the apostles in AD 30 still applies to us today. See to it that no one misleads you.
Rise